Don't let YouTube decide what information you get. That's your choice. YouTube is deleting our videos and cuts you off from a source of honest reporting. Make sure you don't lose access to NTD's news content, and take a quick moment to subscribe to our newsletter so no matter what happens here, you'll keep your access to a trustworthy news source.
Beijing hits back at Washington for working to reduce its reliance on China. That's after President Biden issued new orders to secure supply chains. We dive into Biden's China policy during his first month in office. Questions are rising about China's food supply, though Beijing says it has more than enough. It follows 2020's record-breaking high grain imports. And a tragedy in Indonesia. A nurse there died in the hospital, just days after getting the first half of a Chinese-made virus vaccine. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Beijing is calling President Biden's move to further decouple unrealistic. That's after Biden signed an executive order to be less reliant on China. NTD's Juliet Song has the latest.
Beijing is hitting back at Washington's efforts to cut reliance on China, calling them unrealistic. This comes after President Biden's executive order on Wednesday. While it doesn't mention China by name, it aims to shift the supply chains of critical products like rare earth minerals and pharmaceuticals out of China.
We shouldn't have to rely on a foreign country, especially one that doesn't share our interests or our values, in order to protect and provide our people during a national emergency.
Right now, the U.S. counts on China for several of these essential products. Without them, production in a number of sectors could come to a grinding halt. Take rare earth minerals, for example. These metals are used to build things like fighter jets, computers, and cell phones. And currently, 80% of America's rare earth comes from China. Beijing is reportedly considering limits on its rare earth exports to the U.S., something that would deal a major blow to domestic industries. America also relies on China for almost 90% of certain medical products. Biden's executive order aims to close these gaps. It would start a 100-day review of 4 critical products: semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earth minerals, and large-capacity batteries. The order also asks federal agencies to start a 1-year review of 6 key sectors. That includes areas like defense, public health, and communications technology. To strengthen supply chains, Biden said the U.S. would increase its domestic production and work with allies for alternative supplies. Juliet Song, NTD News.
Now we look to President Biden's China policies. What has he done so far? Biden's team has repeatedly said they are not in a rush on China.
But we are not in a rush.
Some experts estimate it may take up to 8 months before the administration finalizes its policies. But some major actions so far may help give an idea of future directions. Taiwan's de facto ambassador to the U.S. was invited to Biden's inauguration. This is the first time Taiwan was formally represented at a presidential swearing-in since the U.S. established relations with Communist China and cut ties with Taiwan. The administration also ramped up activities in the South China Sea to counter Beijing's ambitions in the region and to back Taiwan. And on Wednesday, Biden signed an executive order. The White House said the order doesn't target any country and will review supply chain vulnerabilities. But next moves could potentially include cutting supply chain reliance on China for critical products. Some of these steps were already undertaken by the Trump administration. On human rights, the State Department under Biden has reaffirmed that the CCP's crackdown on the Uyghur population is a genocide. Biden also promised there will be repercussions for the Chinese regime, but he has not yet taken specific actions or offered any concrete plan. He says he will first focus on domestic issues. Biden signed 15 executive orders several hours after inauguration. They reversed some of Trump's key policies, but none of them about China. But also within these several hours, 3 Chinese telecom giants asked the New York Stock Exchange to rethink their planned delisting. The 3 were targeted by a Trump executive order. The order bars Americans from investing in military-linked Chinese companies. According to the ban, U.S. investors need to stop buying blacklisted securities from January 11th. But a week after inauguration, the Biden administration said it's going to extend the deadline. Americans can still invest in these companies until May of this year. Around the same time, Biden withdrew a Trump-era rule that required American schools to report their relationships with Beijing-funded Confucius Institutes. These are language classes sponsored by the Chinese regime. They've been accused of spreading pro-CCP propaganda on U.S. campuses. In addition, Biden also halted Trump's effort to ban Chinese apps like WeChat and TikTok. Trump accused the two Chinese apps of collecting Americans' data. The data is at risk of being offered to the CCP, and that raises national security concerns. Also in the tech field, Republican senators placed a hold on the confirmation of Biden's pick for Commerce Secretary earlier this month. That's because she refused to say whether she would keep Chinese military-linked telecom giant Huawei on a U.S. trade blacklist. Biden also has to decide what to do with many of Trump's executive orders that are yet to be implemented. These include potentially banning investment in Chinese digital payment giant Alipay and tech companies like Tencent, TikTok, and WeChat, and sanctioning financial entities involved in the CCP's crackdown on Hong Kong, among others. China's grain import in 2020 broke records. That's in contrary to Beijing's claim that there is no food shortage in China. Data released by Chinese Customs shows that last year, the country imported 142 million tons of grain. This is the first time grain imports exceeded 140 million tons. That's also a close to 30% increase compared to the previous year. Imports of corn more than doubled. The figure draws into question one of Beijing's narratives on food. Despite severe flooding and other natural disasters in China last year, the communist regime claimed that grain production had hit record highs in 2020. But farmers across China reported crop failures and hugely reduced harvest levels. Food shortage in China appears to be worsening in recent years. In 2014, China became the world's largest food importer. Since 2015, China has imported more than 100 million tons of grain each year. Beijing's official figures have always been questioned. Many believe the real situation may be even worse. On top of natural disasters, corruption is also making food shortage even worse. In 2020, the CCP Central Commission for Discipline Inspection issued a document stating, quote, corruption in the grain sector is alarming. As early as 2013, CCP head Xi Jinping said, quote, for years, there have been many incidents happening in the National Grain Depot. Xi referred to corrupt officials stealing grain and selling them for profit. 80% of Chinese companies have withdrawn their applications to list on China's stock market. That's after Chinese authorities asked them to hand in their audit books for inspection. According to Chinese media, the country's stock market regulator, called the China Securities Association, conducted random spot checks last month. The review targeted companies applying for initial public offerings or IPOs. It's an important step for companies trying to get listed and to bring in money from the public. Out of more than 400 companies, 20 were selected for the random checks. As of Wednesday, 16 out of those 20 had withdrawn their applications before the inspection even started. Among the other 300 companies that were not selected, 16 withdrew their IPO applications too. A person familiar with the matter told media outlets that the companies withdrew their applications to avoid punishment. That's because they often make what he called irregular statements in their financial and information disclosures. For years, foreign efforts to inspect Chinese company audits have also met with issues. Notably, companies wishing to list in the U.S. face financial inspection from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Without the department's approval, firms cannot list in the American market. Most foreign companies comply with the rule, but Chinese law prevents audit books from leaving China. As a result, U.S. authorities can't inspect the audits from Chinese companies listed in the U.S. In December, then-President Donald Trump signed the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act into law. The rule blocks foreign companies from trading on the U.S. stock market if they refuse to submit their audits. If this law goes into effect as directed, it'll likely lead to many Chinese companies being delisted from U.S. exchanges in the coming years. More than 200 Chinese companies are listed on U.S. exchanges right now. One of China's largest state-owned financial insurance firms is making headlines. That's as a former employee alleges decades of corruption. NTD's Juliet Song has more on that.
A Chinese insurance giant is going viral. The company, China Life Insurance, is one of China's largest state-owned financial insurance providers. But now a former employee is accusing one of its subsidiaries of decades of corruption. In a video posted online, the former employee says she's worked for the subsidiary for 16 years, adding she's grateful for the job opportunity. But she doesn't seem to enjoy her time there.
In this company, none of the management has a conscience. They lie to their clients, harm citizens, hollow out the company, and suppress employees.
Zhang alleges one of the company's managers is guilty of corruption in several areas. For one, he's fabricated about 200 fake employees every year in order to profit from the bonuses and training costs allocated for them. She also says the manager creates fake invoices for different social events with clients and later gets reimbursed for the expenses that didn't actually happen. Zhang claims the company has lost at least $1 million over the years because of the practices. She says the manager isolated her after she refused to help him with the fraud. She was fired in 2019. A hashtag highlighting the alleged corruption now has over 600 million views on Chinese social media. China Life Insurance says the allegations are under investigation. Juliet Song, NTD News.
A nurse in Indonesia died after receiving a CCP virus vaccine dose made in China. Malaysian newspaper China Press reported on Wednesday that the 33-year-old nurse from Indonesia's Blitar city tested positive for the virus. Just 9 days after receiving a shot from Chinese drug maker Sinovac's vaccine. The nurse, named Ernie Kusama Sukmadui, only got the first dose of the two-shot vaccine. She received it in late January. Before she could get the second infection, she developed a fever, shortness of breath, and a cough. A week after the shot, she was admitted to an intensive care unit. A week after that, she died from virus-related complications. Indonesia's Ministry of Health didn't comment on whether her death could be connected to the vaccine. It only reminded people that the body only develops immunity to the virus after the second dose. Vaccine safety concerns have been raised in China for a decade. Tainted vaccine scandals there have in some cases caused severe side effects, disabilities, and even death. The issue has come into question again recently when a certain Chinese-made vaccine listed more than 70 possible side effects in its instructions for use. China has been exporting CCP virus vaccines to dozens of countries in recent months, pushing what officials call vaccine diplomacy, but effectively competing against its Western rivals. But none of the Chinese-made vaccines have been approved by the World Health Organization for emergency use, partly because their clinical trial data is not complete. Surveys show global trust in Chinese vaccines is plunging as well. According to Taiwan-based media, a survey released on Tuesday revealed only 1.3% of Taiwanese people would accept a Chinese-made vaccine. Former U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo is calling attention to the Chinese regime's poor biosafety records. He points to intelligence at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. More on that by NTD's Allison Lee.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his senior China policy advisor Miles Yu are demanding that the Chinese Communist Party take biosafety seriously. They also call on the international community to hold the CCP accountable if it fails to uphold global biosafety standards. In an opinion piece published in the Wall Street Journal this Tuesday, Pompeo and Yu argue the CCP's negligence on biosafety is putting the world at risk. They say, quote, most signs point to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or WIV, as the source of COVID-19. They quote then-director of WIV's warning in 2018 that the biosafety laboratory is a double-edged sword. It can be used for the benefit of humanity, but can also lead to a disaster. The then-director also acknowledged China's biology labs lack operational technical support, professional instructions, and feasible standards for safety requirements. Pompeo and Yu also highlight that a 2016 safety survey conducted by the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology on 75 bioresearch labs in China finds that WIV didn't even make it to the top 20 in terms of quality. Pompeo and Yu also say the State Department confirmed last month that the WIV conducts secret bioweapons research with the People's Liberation Army, or PLA. They say this is why the PLA sent a general to take over WIV soon after the outbreak in Wuhan. They say the world has a responsibility to make sure the CCP is not given a free pass on biosafety. Reporting by Allison Lee, NTD News.
U.S. telecom giant AT&T is, quote, placing profit over and above human rights. This, according to former Commerce Department Undersecretary Corey Stewart. On Wednesday, Stewart verified allegations that AT&T's senior executive vice president requested to keep a Chinese military-controlled company off a U.S. blacklist. The accusation first came from a report by National File. It alleges that AT&T pressured the Commerce Department to keep Chinese telecom firm China-Taiwan off the entity list. The entity list is reserved for foreign companies engaged in human rights violations or with national security risks. Stewart says that through China-Telecom, the Chinese regime has been using cell phone technology to spy on minority populations and send this information to the state police. AT&T is involved in a joint venture with China-Telecom, and the company admitted it did not want China-Telecom to be sanctioned. It told Fox News, quote, without a relationship with a licensed Chinese communications company, no non-Chinese provider can serve U.S. companies operating in China. In addition to human rights violations, there are also national security concerns regarding China-Telecom. Last year, President Trump issued an executive order banning U.S. investments in Chinese military-linked companies. He believes these firms could potentially spy on Americans, and China-Telecom was among them. But AT&T is not the only company that allegedly put profit over human rights. It's also happening with a Swedish company. Last month, Swedish telecom giant Ericsson pleaded against a domestic ban on Huawei. This despite the Chinese telecom giant being Ericsson's main competitor. A researcher at the American Enterprise Institute says that's because Ericsson has stakes in the Chinese market. Her analysis shows that Ericsson's Chinese market revenue is around 8% of its total earnings. The State Department under President Trump accused Huawei of providing information to the Chinese regime that aids human rights abuses. A Stanford University specialist on Chinese military policy says she has information on China's Taiwan approach. It comes from what Chinese military leaders have told her. According to them, Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping believes the country's military will be able to take over Taiwan within 2 years. Last Thursday, in a virtual hearing before the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission, specialist Oriana Schuyler Mastro said U.S. deterrence against China's attack on Taiwan is at its weakest since the 50s. But she also predicted that Xi Jinping won't attack unless he's sure to succeed. U.S.-based news website Roll Call says that Western analysts predict China is more than 5 years away from being able to attack Taiwan. Hong Kong-based newspaper Apple Daily seems to agree. It argues that an attack within 2 years is unlikely because the Chinese military isn't advanced enough. At the same time, China is still trying to figure out America's stance on the subject. Roll Call claimed the biggest deterrent to Beijing attacking Taiwan is the chance of going up against other allied nations, in addition to the U.S. The website quoted a former deputy special representative for North Korea at the U.S. State Department, who said, quote, expansion of Taiwan's role in the world is in a sense an expansion of deterrence. Thursday's hearing came as the Biden administration reviews the Trump administration's Taiwan policies. Under Trump, the United States increased its diplomatic relations and security aid to Taiwan. In an interview with MSNBC, Secretary of State Antony Blinken did not directly respond to a question on what actions the U.S. would take if China moves against Taiwan. And in the UK, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson isn't committing to a boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. This after an opposition leader asked whether London would stay away from the event over Chinese human rights abuses.
Today, millions of Uyghur people in China live in fear under a cruel regime. The BBC, international media, and human rights NGOs are all reporting on forced labour camps, women being raped and sterilised, and families being separated. This is a genocide happening in front of our eyes. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that unless China ends this genocide, Britain and Team GB should boycott the Winter Olympics in Beijing next year.
Uyghurs are an ethnic minority group living in China's western Xinjiang region. Reports say the Chinese regime put more than 1 million of them in detention camps. Responding to the question, Johnson said the UK is working with allies to hold China accountable on human rights issues, but he isn't committing to boycotting the events.
We're not normally in favour of sporting boycotts in this country, Mr. Speaker, and that's been the long-standing position of this government.
Beijing is set to host the Winter Olympics in 2022. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.